Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. We're now moving to the next section of the programme. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, okay. So moving to the next section of the programme, which is going to be looking more at some of the specific findings and recommendations from the report itself. My name is Sophie Yarker. I'm a research fellow based at the University of Manchester. I work on the Ambition for Ageing programme there, and I'm the lead author of the report, which draws together findings from 5 different areas and 5 different neighbourhoods across the UK. So the need from this research, just to give you some background, came from 2 areas of research or 2 areas of interest, I should say, that we were interested within the Ambition for Ageing programme. So the first was a need to understand how older people from different minority ethnic groups, how different people experience social isolation in very different ways. So recognising that people from different minority ethnic groups will experience it different from themselves, and certainly different from older British white people themselves as well. So we need to understand those experiences in a more kind of qualitative way particularly. The second area of interest was around social infrastructure or shared spaces, and looking at how shared spaces can support the social relationships and connections of older people, and therefore how these spaces can help reduce social isolation. So it was these 2 twin areas of interest that were brought together within this research. So the research was carried out in August 2019, which is obviously a very long time ago now in all sorts of ways. But it was looking primarily at how older people from within particular minority ethnic communities use different types of social infrastructure. And we had a particular focus on community and voluntary organisations within these communities and the work that they do to support older people. So in Birmingham, Manchester, Leicester and Camden, we focused on South Asian communities, quite broadly defined. And in Hackney, we focused on older people from the Turkish, Kurdish and Greek Cypriot background. And that was very much led by the organisations we were working with and local knowledge from those areas. So in each place, we carried out qualitative interviews with older people from those backgrounds and asked them about the spaces and institutions that were important to them. And we also conducted a survey of community and voluntary organisations working with minority ethnic groups within those neighbourhoods as well. So what we're going to do now then is we're going to hear from speakers from 3 different areas involved in the research, and we're asked each group of speakers to reflect on a different finding or recommendation from the report, and particularly reflect on it from their perspective of the work they've done in their areas. So firstly then, I'm going to hand over to our first set of speakers from Leicester. So Bharati and Rahina are going to say a little bit about the risks of social isolation for older people from minority ethnic communities in their area.
Thank you, Sophie. Hello, everyone. My name is Bharati Mistry, and my colleague Rahana Sadat and I are going to do the presentation on the risk of social isolation amongst BME communities. I will now hand over to Rahana to do the first part of the presentation.
Right, please bear with me. Right, hello everyone. Right, we're going to look at some of the risks of isolation amongst the communities we've been working with. Leicester Ageing Together has been working in collaboration with their partners since 2015 to reduce isolation and loneliness in people aged 50 and above in the city of Leicester. Leicester is a very diverse city, and almost 50% of the population of Leicester is from Black and minority ethnic communities. Now, there are many factors that affect people in terms of the risks to isolation. However, we don't have the time to go through all of them, but we're going to focus on a few of those today. 37% of the population of Leicester is made up of South Asian communities, which is why we've decided to focus on the South Asian community in our presentation. And Belgrave and Highfields are predominantly South Asian, with the Spinney Hill ward, which includes Highfields, which has a population of over 75% of South Asians, and the Belgrave ward has more than 77% South Asian population. and the majority of South Asians are Indian. These areas are densely populated, deprivation is high, some of the most deprived communities, low-income families, health is also a huge issue. So the data is showing that South Asians and Black groups are 2 to 4 times more likely to develop type 2 diabetes, often diagnosed by the age of 25 or under, whereas in the general population, it's 40 years. And the data is also finding that the most common causes of death in South Asian communities is heart disease and strokes. Before I pass on to my colleague Bharti, I wanted to share a few things about the cultural factors. Having an awareness of the communities you're engaging with and having people with the skills is really vital in terms of getting the outcomes you're wanting to achieve. Some of the things that we've found is that gender roles within South Asian communities are still very defined within the family and within these communities. And patriarchy is still very prevalent, not only in families and communities, but even in the institutes. So religious institutes are quite core to these communities, and they have a huge part to play in this. So that can often be a risk factor. And the other thing is that, so reputation, honor, ingrained since childhood, and, you know, the idea that, you know, the consequences of your actions not only impact on you and your family, but also on your community, and that can also be a barrier. Some of the lessons we've learned is that some people struggle in mixed groups for various reasons. For example, men want to keep up the persona of being strong, and they don't want to be, you know, seen as vulnerable, because often sharing emotions is seen as a weakness. Whereas with women, we found in mixed settings, they were less kind of reluctant to engage, didn't open up, held back, and let the men lead, you know, even in the simplest of choices when we were asking them what activities they wanted. However, when we had a women-only setting, those same women were completely different, very relaxed and fully engaging. And the other thing we found in terms of older people is that when they've started accessing groups that are local and they trust and know, they start feeling more comfortable about attending mixed events and groups that have been recommended by those host organizations. And they're more willing to participate and access generic services. However, a lot of hand-holding is involved and support is often required. I'm going to pass you over to my colleague Bharti now.
So community engagement. In a diverse city like Leicester, it really helps to know the different communities, as one size fits all approach just doesn't work. So lessons learned is work in partnership, involve the local community, the local organizations, local champions, local groups from the start, so you get their buy-in. They know and understand the people, the culture, faith, language, and the difficulties faced. So what we're saying is work bottom up rather than the traditional top down. And then use a range of community languages to reach people via different media, you know, leaflets, posters, newspapers, radio, video, WhatsApp, Facebook. They can all be conducive. And then using simple language with illustration, larger font, as there is a low level of literacy for some older people. And this was clearly seen during the beginning of COVID, where initially all the information was in English. And lastly on this slide, it takes time to engage and build trust. It takes time for people to open up and talk about their challenges, their concerns. So funding needs to be long-term investment, as old age and social isolation, they're not going to disappear. And then mental well-being. Some cultures attach stigma when talking about feelings, thoughts, loneliness and isolation. And mental health is thought of as a weakness, something to hide. And this can be really hard for those struggling to talk openly and ask for help, while others feel that mental health issues are part of the aging process. So lessons learned include need to be aware of cultural sensitivity for mental health, as it can help to understand to deliver effective services. Along with that, cultural competence is also really important. And then to offer services that are accessible and in a language that older people can communicate in, i.e. their mother tongue. And then prevention in the form of information, workshops, and education needs to be widely available and accessible. And this is my last slide, technology potential. Now, technology is advancing really fast, and there seems to be a huge potential that needs to be tapped into to alleviate some of the issues of social isolation. So during COVID, for those that had the means, some people have really thrived. And this quote is a WhatsApp quote sent from Mrs. P. So I'll just read it out. I would like to thank you as well to introducing me to these new groups. I was only going 1 hour for my exercises at Belgrave Neighborhood Center. But at this difficult time, you gave me the chance to communicate with these new groups. Since I've joined these exercise groups, my headache is gone, as I'm suffering from high blood pressure. I can sleep a bit better than before. And as I have frozen shoulder to my left arm, it's getting better. So my health is a bit better than before, as I'm looking forward to attending these groups on Zoom. And I've really seen her change, you know, from the beginning to now. She's just such a happy person. So I'm not saying, you know, that technology is a substitute for human interaction. It isn't. But I leave you with this one thought. Can you imagine someone who is housebound, but now with technology, they are socially active? It is possible. You know, COVID has shown us this, that people are more open to technology. So let's embrace it. Let's use it for its best. And then lastly, we've got our website at the bottom, which has got a lot more learning, because this is a short presentation. But, you know, Leicester Aging Together, please visit it and you'll find lots more information. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. That was really, really helpful. And I think particularly the last slide at the end, there was a lot of stuff in that quote that was really rich and quite telling, that I'm sure we can pick up in reflections and questions later on. So conscious of time, so now we're going to come to Shelley Khan, who's going to reflect a little bit more on the different types of social infrastructure or shared space that are important to some of the older people from minority ethnic communities that she's been working with in Camden. So I'll hand over to you, Shelley.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this conference. So I'm from Health Watch Camden, and we did the Camden work. Just briefly to give you a background, we concentrated on 2 areas in Camden, which was the Regent's Park ward and Somerstown and St Pancras ward in Camden. Both these wards are among some of the most deprived in London. Most of the households are social housing, and people live in blocks, either couples or people on their own. Some have children. The areas are very well connected by transport. Although in one of the wards, which is St Pancras and Somerstown, there is the high-speed rail tour that has caused some significant features and disruption for people to travel. They're also ethnically very diverse and religiously as well. Both the wards are you know, largely Christian and Muslim majority in London. Just to give you a brief background, we recruited 12 Bangladeshi residents over the age of 50. All were Muslims. There were 7 men and 5 women, although to note, 2 of the women dropped out fairly early on because they found that keeping the log diary was too much for them. I do tend to speak a bit fast, so if you want me to repeat something later, please do so. I'm very conscious of this. What we learned about social value and where people go is that mainly people go to the park because green spaces are very important to them, and I'll cover a bit more later on. The men mostly go to the mosque where they congregate. They also meet their friends, people they know, they pass their time. They also go to the local specialist shops where they meet their friends, sometimes just say hello, and there's a local coffee shop that the men go to, but not the women. The women mainly go to the community centres, and as the previous speaker said, it's often a women-only environment, and they feel safe, they feel confident to talk about their issues, and they also get their help. They also tend to go to specialist markets, not within Camden, but to another borough, namely Tower Hamlets. So they go to Whitechapel and Brick Lane. If you know London, you will know that that is significantly with a large Bangladeshi community, and they go there because it has the culture, it meets their cultural needs, and it has a large community, so they feel comfortable. They go with their friends, they spend a day out, they do their shopping. So shopping to women was very, very important. However, the subsequent questions about places really was about, you know, people value the visits with their families, and not so much with anyone else. So that spoke more to the social value of the visits, and specifically the chance to meet people from from their own Bangladeshi community. Among the 10 interviews left, all placed high value on social connections, as I've said, with the Bangladeshi community. Sorry, I'm just going through my notes a little bit, forgive me. The weekly in-depth conversation at the mosque sort of kind of indicated a quite strong bridging, but there was also a lot of weak bridging between the community, and that was the passing conversations in Bengali at the local Bangladeshi shops. So there was a bit of weak and strong bridging there. The men reported more capital bonding, with 5 out of the 7 male interviews reporting regular social meetings with friends and acquaintances through the mosque particularly, and the coffee shop. The women, as I've said, had more weak bridging, and they did not attend the mosque, although one did attend an Islamic center on a regular basis, and none of the women made any references to a coffee shop. And as I've kind of said, that the distance and difficulty of travel wasn't an issue for them when they went to a specialist area such as Brick Lane or Tower Hamlets. They, you know, wanted to go and did go in groups, but it was cited as a reason for perhaps not to engage in other services in the local area. People find like going to the leisure centre too difficult, or perhaps to a library. So that's an interesting find, and I think that just highlights that where they feel confident, there is cultural where it meets their cultural needs, they will travel that much further to go and get the service or the shopping that they want to do so. For example, you know, some of the men said, I quote, "It's a coffee shop in the local area where we friends go and chat, and lots of people from our Bangladeshi community go there. I go there to pass the time with people from my community, have a chat and drink tea. we have long conversations and discussions about our life and Bangladesh. We read the papers and discuss. One of the things to note actually is that people over the age of 50 that we spoke to still refer to, oh gosh, I've just got 1 minute left, I'm going on. I'm going to quickly go through, still refer to as Bangladesh being their home, and that's where their primary interest is. But in summary, that the most interesting fact was that the social contacts, and it was most within the Bangladeshi community, and that the bonding social capital within the Bangladeshi community was stronger than the bridging capital between different social groups. That was very, very weak. So they would say hello, goodbye to people they came across, but that was nothing more than that. And the other thing quickly I'm going to say is that with regards to going back to open spaces, a lot of the women felt unsafe using open spaces in current climate. And there's a lot of social isolation between the elderly community and older women, particularly those who've lost their partners or their families have moved out. They have very little places to go to. And it's further compounded by the lack of language and the facilities nearby, and the community centres being losing their funding. They're heavily dependent on the services that the community centres provide. And it's certainly in Camden, one or two of the very well-used community centres have had a cutback, and that has had a lot of impact on the local community, and especially the local women who need a lot of help, a lot of support, as the previous speakers have said. And I think funders, if you are listening, if you are here today, that's to make a note, take a note of that. And people are very, very reliant on information in their own language that is provided. They're still dependent on that. And the notion that, you know, extended families and they take care of their own is diminishing day by day. People are very much on their own, and they have to survive on their own. And it's something that we need to forward plan. And whereas loneliness and isolation affects everybody, for the minority community where there is a language barrier as well, it really is compounded, and we really need to take that. So thank you very much. I know I've warbled through that. I hope you know that has given you a flavour of what we've done.
Thank you very much, Shelley. That was really helpful. And obviously there's a lot more of the detail in the report, but I think that really highlights the complexities of the different types of relationships which are important to people at different times of their lives, which is something we can pick up later on. So thank you for that. And finally then, we're going to hand over to Mohammed, who's based in Birmingham, and Mohammed is going to reflect a little bit more on some of the findings of the report that particularly looked at how organisations within minority ethnic communities work, and some of the issues around partnership working for those organisations. So I'll hand over to Mohammed. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I work for an organisation called Asiana Community Project, based here in inner city Birmingham. So some excellent information already provided by the previous speakers. Our bit of research, we looked at the similar sort of things as the other providers, but we actually looked at the organizations working within the setup. So initially we approached 17 organizations, of which 11 organizations replied. And within those organizations, vast majority of them were not set up as single issue organizations, though. They were not just like organizations dealing with elderly people or elderly welfare or things like that. The vast majority of the organizations are actually multi-issue organizations trying to address issues in the community in general. Some of them come about specifically in response to one or two issues, but as need and demand required, they actually move to address multiple different issues, because at times there were really a lack of BME community organizations to be able to address individual issues. So you have an individual elderly people organization, or an individual women's organization, or an individual organization just training BME women. So what happened is, by necessity, these organizations ended up trying to do multiple layer of things. So there are, within that, there are actually two organizations that specifically set themselves up as supporting older people, or providing venues for older people to get together and have discussions, and just to try. Some people might not understand a chai and chat, cup of tea and a discussion. So there's two organizations that specifically set up to do that sort of thing. But as time has moved on, funding has got tighter, and for a long time there was a culture of competitive tendering for funding, which actually has forced a lot of organizations not to think about working together. That actually, for survival, for actually providing services to the communities, for the communities that they serve, they've actually had to competitively tender. So bringing organizations together to actually work in partnership became a challenge. So when we started looking at this issue a long time before Aging Better or anything else was on the horizon. Some of us felt that after the 2008 cutbacks and the financial turmoil, that if we wanted to survive as organizations providing services to our communities, then we needed to start working together. We didn't come together for any specific program. We didn't come together to actually look at this is lottery or European funding or anything else. We just came together to discuss what was actually happening, what would be needed, what organizations might close down, what organizations may actually carry on. And it was not easy. We started off by inviting about 30 organizations. The first meeting, only 8 organizations came, because there was no money to be divvied out. It was just like, let's get together and discuss what our issues are. And some organizations felt quite comfortable because they'd been around donkey's years. They thought they would survive everything. They don't need to talk to anybody. And most of those larger organizations that previously attempted to get the hundreds of thousands of pounds weren't interested. The smaller organizations that actually wanted to work together were actually, yeah, let's have a chat. What harm can it do us? If you've got no money, there's nothing you're going to take away from us. There's nothing you can give us. So let's get together and have a discussion anyway. So we actually built on that. Then one or two of the larger organizations decided, when they actually looked around, that maybe it'd be better to come together. So eventually we ended up with a partnership, a group of organizations, a consortium rather than a partnership of 11, 12 organizations. But there was still this very much, oh, what is in it for us feeling. And to be fair, there probably was a little bit of that from Asiana itself. I work for an organization called Asiana Community Project. So there was that issue, and because of all this previous competitive tendering and everything in the same locality or in the wider locality of about 3 miles, we'd all been tendering and competing with each other, there was still that sort of issue. But as we talked and as we discussed, we met every couple of months without anything to specifically look at other than how we could mutually survive together, or how we could better support clients. That if one organization doesn't have a specialist advisor in debt, another one does. Why don't we just work together? So if we get somebody who's in need, then we can actually refer them to that organization, or their advisors can come over and work from our center without actually exchanging any money. And it started working. It took about 18 months, but it started working. So there's always individual politics that come into this, and there are actually then organizations that were in the group that are actually religious based, and some organizations are minority ethnic based. Some of those communities have actually had tensions relating back to India, Pakistan, Bangladesh and all that. So some of those politics also came with it. So I'm not going to say it was all fun and frolics and we all had a cup of tea and shared cake and everybody laughed and joked. There was some really tenuous and tense conversations. We actually had, we worked with some church organizations, and there was a lot of tension amongst the, some of the mosques and churches actually having to get together to look at this issue. So our partnership of 11, 12 organizations spread across a few communities, which was deliberate, and a few ethnic minority communities. We didn't just want to make it all Pakistani communities or all Muslim communities. So we actually went out of our way, about 4 of the organizations, to try and bring on partner people within the consortium that could actually reflect wider experiences and wider communities. And it actually really brought some challenges. I can't emphasize enough. I don't really want to go into some of the individual arguments that occurred between people in meetings, because just purely because they're from different communities. Nothing to do with what we were discussing, just purely because they're from different communities. Cricket is a great divider. Some people say it's a great leveler, but I say it's a great divider among some of our communities. So just discussing something just became a cricket match, and the cricket match then became, we won in 1974 and you lost in 1982 and whatever. So, all these conversations took part. Then the statutory sector does not help. I don't know how many other organizations out there have experienced this, but they actually, despite talking about less working consortiums and groups, they actually put out these specialist tender specifications that naturally try and split the organizations from working away. We actually still tried to stick together. So when Aging Better came together, we asked one of our larger organizations to actually, so the consortium within itself got both bits of the Aging Better money, the hub development and the Sparkbrook. So the consortium in itself got those. One was led by Narthex, a church-led organization. It's a church-founded organization. I wouldn't say a church-led organization. And the other bit was actually hosted by Muath Trust, which is a Yemeni Muslim-led organization. So that in itself was a bit of a shock to some of the commissioners as to how these two very diverse communities have actually managed to come together to win both tenders. So it was actually the work in the consortium, and this was 3 years after we started meeting together. In the meantime, we have actually been successful as consortiums in actually accessing other funding. And to be fair, if we were going to talk about success, we will talk about success. As a consortium, we probably managed to access about £5 million of funding. So when it works well. But the money that when it comes down is also a great divider, especially when people think that these are large numbers. But when you actually think we are actually providing services to nearly 250,000 people, and in between the consortium, we're probably employing over 140 people, then the 5 million is over 5 years or 6 years doesn't actually become a huge number that it first sounds. So yeah, we've actually been successful. The statutory sector.
Sorry, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, and it's very difficult to chair when it's virtual, but we are running a little bit short of time. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to stop you there, and then we can come back to some more reflections in the questions. We'll have more time to speak then, if that's all right. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I thought I would handle that. Oh.
So thank you very much to our speakers. It was really great to have those insights from how things actually work on the ground, particularly from Mohammed and from different areas of the UK, which have obviously informed the report. Obviously, I'm aware of time, so by way of conclusion, I'm just going to offer a very quick couple of reflections in light of COVID-19, because obviously this research took place beforehand, and I know our speakers have kind of touched on it as they've gone through their work of what this might mean for how they continue their work in the future with social isolation and social distancing in place. So I just want to offer a few reflections on what the potential risks and associated challenges are around this, and again picking up on what people have already said. So I'll just kind of go through this in 3 steps. So I think, which has already been highlighted, one of the main risks that we are going to see post COVID-19 as we move into an era of living with the virus and some form of social distancing being in place to some extent, we're going to risk more sections of the older population becoming even more socially isolated, and increased social isolation for those who are already cut off from their social networks. So during lockdown, obviously various institutions and social infrastructure was closed, so people were physically cut off from being able to access those spaces and access those sources of social support. And as we've seen things reopen, partially reopen, either with restricted functioning or people not being able to access those spaces for various reasons, we're going to see the kind of changes in how people use these spaces, and therefore changes in people's social relationships. So if people are being advised to avoid using public transport, for example, how then does that affect some of the older people who are travelling quite some distances to access specialist markets, for example? People, if they already have mobility restrictions, how will it then affect them? And also, I think we've heard a lot about the kind of emotional barriers that people will face. We cannot expect older people to simply pick up from where they left off. A lot of people have been socially distanced and shielding for a very long period of time. And even though people might be told they can go back out and access these spaces, they may have lost the confidence to do this. So one of the main challenges there then is, if we're going to open up these spaces again, how can we remain socially distant and kind of recognize the real threat of the virus, but also do it in a way that kind of welcomes people back and makes people feel safe and confident to use these spaces again in a way that's appropriate to them. We hear a lot about reopening institutions because of a risk of economic recession, but we also need to be very mindful of the impacts of a social recession as well, particularly for people who are already socially isolated. So the second challenge and risk that I would mention is a kind of broader one around risks of segregation and exclusion. Can people still hear me okay? That's fine. So if we've already heard that for a lot of cases, a lot of these older people are maybe having very strong bonding capitals. They're meeting with people from their own communities and their own cultural identity, but they're maybe not having as much interaction with people from other communities in and around them. And if we kind of go down a route of more social distancing and regulations, we need to also make sure that we maintain the aspect of having informal interactions with people. We don't end up with kind of parallel social infrastructure for different groups of people, where people aren't coming into contact with each other and aren't having opportunities to mix and come into contact with people of different backgrounds to them. So we need to kind of maintain this within our social infrastructure. And I think particularly this is maybe where green space becomes particularly important, as a space which is more likely to remain open and accessible. So we need to kind of redouble on our efforts to make sure that green spaces and parks remain age-friendly and inclusive and open to as many people as possible. And the third and final risk and challenge I wanted to mention was the risk of exacerbated inequalities. We've already seen that the community and voluntary organisations within the sector are really struggling in terms of financial support and various types of resources and being able to forward plan. And obviously COVID-19 is kind of an extra crisis on top of that in terms of having to respond to that very quickly and kind of plan for the future. So as much as we need much more funding and kind of financial support, we also need to make sure that we create the right opportunities for innovation within the sector, so the sector is able to respond in a way which is appropriate to them. We've heard quite a lot about participatory approaches and working with communities themselves to identify their needs and be able to work on them. So some of the things we've looked at, particularly with Ambition for Aging, is kind of looking at a more kind of non-linear way of working. So a more of a test and learn approach. So having the space and the flexibility to try out new ideas and not worry so much about their failure, but learning from those. So this needs to be supported by policy around investment in skills and leadership, and also kind of the supportive of collaboration and sharing ideas, which obviously Mohammed was talking about a little bit earlier. So we need to kind of find socially distant and appropriate ways of doing this. But I think there is a very, very real danger that unless we actively pursue these agendas, there's a real risk that a lot more people are going to be even more left behind by COVID-19. And the implications from that. So that kind of brings us to the end of this particular section. So thank you very much to the speakers for reflecting on their experiences of the research. Thank you for everyone who was involved in the research in the first place. And we hope you find the report helpful and the basis for future work, certainly. So I think I'm now going to hand back to Atia, but before I do so, I think we have another short video to show you. So thank you very much for your time.